We're carrying on our post-Easter series entitled Perspectives on the Resurrection. And today we're considering 3 stories where the prophets Elijah and Elisha restore people to life, one of which we heard read to us. I think we sometimes misremember the regularity of resurrections in the Bible, thinking they were fairly commonplace in a time when miraculous occurrences were much more frequent. But there are actually only 10 resurrection events recorded in the whole of the Bible, with the 3 we are looking at this morning, the sum total mentioned in the Old Testament. Then there are the 3 carried out by Jesus, the widow of Nain's son, which I spoke on in January, Jairus' daughter, and Lazarus, who Tim will be speaking on next week. Next, and most obviously, we have the resurrection of Jesus himself, which Matthew tells us was accompanied by the raising to life of many holy people in Jerusalem, whose tombs broke open at the moment of Jesus' death, and who then emerged from their tombs, raised to life when Jesus' resurrection took place. We're up to 8 resurrection events now, if you're keeping count. 3 in the Old Testament, 3 carried out by Jesus, and 2 simultaneously at the first Easter. The final 2 are recounted in the book of Acts. In Acts 9, Peter restores to life a faithful, servant-hearted woman called Tabitha, or Dorcas in Greek, after being summoned by her broken-hearted fellow believers. And in Acts 20, Paul restores to life a young man called Eutychus, who is sitting on a window ledge, sinks into a deep sleep during Paul's very long sermon, and falls 3 stories to his death. Seems pretty magnanimous of Paul. It doesn't curtail his preaching, though. Having already spoken till midnight, after Eutychus' resurrection, we're told he then carried on until daylight. Don't worry, I have no plans to follow his example, although it's not the shortest. So the point is that when resurrections are recounted in the Bible, they are significant events, meant to stop us in our tracks and capture our attention. They are utterly transformative for the people involved, but should also offer us hope and restoration, which we in turn should seek to share with others. As I mentioned, we're going to focus on the 3 Old Testament examples where Elijah and Elisha restore people to life. It would have taken too long to have all 3 passages read, so I decided we would listen to the story of Elisha and the Shunammite woman and give her some airtime for a change. We seem to have heard the story of the widow of Zarephath's son being raised by Elijah a few times recently. I know I chose it as my second reading when I spoke about Jesus raising the widow of Nain's son, as there are lots of parallels. Don't worry if you missed it previously, as we will still recap the story and notice how it compares with Elisha's encounter. The third story is a very short recount of a miracle which occurs after Elisha's death, but more on that shortly. So let's get stuck into these 3 accounts of miraculous restorations to life. We will consider what takes place, what they teach us, and what about us. So firstly, what takes place? The prophets Elijah and Elisha are thought by most commentators to have lived in the 9th century BC. They were active in the northern kingdom of Israel during the reigns of the kings Ahab, Ahaziah, Jehoram, Jehu, Jehoahaz, and Jehoash. Elisha was a disciple and attendant of Elijah and succeeded him when Elijah ascended to heaven. As I've already mentioned, today we are looking at 1 resurrection event involving Elijah and 2 involving Elisha. So firstly, Elijah's raising of the son of the widow of Zarephath, which is recounted in 1 Kings chapter 17. There is a drought in the land, and God instructs Elijah to head to Zarephath, where a widow will supply him with food. Elijah does as God tells him and spots the widow gathering sticks at the town gate. He asks her for a drink of water and a piece of bread. She explains that she doesn't have any bread, only a handful of flour and a little olive oil. Her plan is to make a final small meal for herself and her son, and then prepare to die of starvation. Elijah asks her to go ahead and make her meal, but make him a small loaf of bread first, then reassures her by making an extraordinary promise that God will not let her jar of flour or jug of oil run out until he sends rain on the land once more. The widow demonstrates amazing faith, making bread for Elijah first, and God honors his miraculous promise, and she has enough food every day for herself, her son, and Elijah, who ends up staying with them. But then tragedy strikes. The widow's son grows increasingly ill until he stops breathing. The widow turns against Elijah, asking what he has against her and suggesting that the death of her son is linked to the prophet judging her for her sinfulness. Rather than responding to these outcries of a devastated mother, Elijah takes action. He takes the dead boy to the upper room where he was staying, lays him on the bed, and then cries out to God. We can hear that he is both devastated and perplexed by what has happened too, as he says, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" You can imagine him thinking, why on earth has God singled out this woman to help me, miraculously kept us alive during an extreme drought, only for her son to die now? He then stretches himself out on top of the boy 3 times and cries out again to God, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." God hears Elijah's cries, and the boy's life is restored. Elijah scoops up the child and rushes down with him to his mother, exclaiming, "Look, your son is alive." What a roller coaster of emotions both Elijah and the widow have gone through in such a short space of time. But the widow is able to vocalize what she is now certain of, saying, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." You might have thought that the miraculous replenishment of her meager ingredients would have already confirmed this to her. But experiencing God's power at work through Elijah in this resurrection event leaves no room for any doubt at all. I'm sure you're already thinking of similarities between that story and the one we heard read about the Shunammite woman, and we will consider how the stories compare in terms of similarities once we've considered both. So let's press straight on and look at Elisha's restoration to life of the Shunammite woman's son in 2 Kings chapter 4. Shunem is a small village near the Jezreel Valley, north of Mount Gilboa. It's where the Philistines camped when they fought Saul, and it was the hometown of Abishag, David's young female companion in his old age. And it was also somewhere Elisha travelled through fairly regularly. The prophet gets to know a woman who lives there. The NIV describes her as well-to-do, and many translations use variations on wealthy. But the original Hebrew word is great, and is used in other places in the Bible to mean wise, so that quality might be inferred here too. She definitely does have means, though, as she first urges Elisha to stay for a meal, and this then becomes a regular occurrence whenever the prophet passes by. Further evidence of her wealth is shown by what happens next. She says to her husband, "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." That's pretty extreme hospitality, isn't it? I think we can get on board with the idea of offering a meal to someone when they're travelling by. But doing a loft conversion just so they have somewhere to sleep? Not so much. I was reminded of some friends my dad made in Nottingham. He went to the opening of a new building at the church he attended as a teenager, St Paul's, Hyson Green, and got chatting to the church warden and his wife, Dennis and Mavis Marriott. They hit it off well, having lots in common and swapped details. When Dad was going to be driving home from Wensleydale in Yorkshire, where he went 4 times a year as a trustee of the Jonas Centre, they arranged that he would stop for dinner before heading on to the B&B he was staying at, as he always broke the journey home. This became a regular feature of his quarterly trips, with him stopping for dinner almost every time. But Dennis and Mavis had downsized after their adult children moved out and did not have a spare room to put Dad up in. And he had a lovely B&B he always stayed in, which he was more than happy to keep using anyway. But I suddenly had a vision of them deciding to completely reconfigure their home to create somewhere for Dad to stay when he passed by 4 times a year. It really would be pretty extreme hospitality, wouldn't it? But that is what the Shunammite woman and her husband do, constructing an upper room for Elisha, which he stays in whenever he passes through Shunem. On one visit, Elisha is in his room and is struck by the thought of doing something for the Shunammite woman to express his gratitude. He gets his servant Gehazi to ask her what they could do in return, after all the trouble she has gone to. Perhaps she needs them to speak to the king or some other important person on her behalf. But she is satisfied with her life, saying that having a home among her own people is blessing enough. Perhaps this is a sign of her wealth, or her wisdom, or a mixture of the two. But she is certainly counting her blessings rather than taking up Elisha's offer to approach God with a wish list. But Elisha is not satisfied with her answer and is determined to find some way to honour her hospitality and generosity. So he asks Gehazi if he has any ideas, and the servant makes a poignant observation. The woman is childless and her husband is old, so she faces the prospect of being a widow without a son to support and protect her, which was a hugely challenging scenario in that day and age. So Elisha summons her and announces that in about a year's time she will hold a baby son in her arms. She can't believe what she's hearing and pleads with Elisha not to mislead her. I guess we might translate that as, "Don't get my hopes up." But she needn't have panicked, because God honours the promise Elisha makes, and she bears a son the following year. We don't hear details of the boy's childhood, but verse 18 simply says, "The child grew," which in a time of infant mortality would have been all that mattered. But then tragedy strikes. The son is in the fields with his father, where reaping is taking place, and suddenly exclaims, "My head, my head!" A servant carries him to his mother, who cradles him in her lap, but at noon, the child dies. She takes the boy and lays him on the bed in Elisha's room, as if being in that special space where the holy man stays might be enough to revive him. But she also decided to go and find Elisha too, and ask her husband for a servant and a donkey so she can make the journey. She has closed the door to Elisha's room and doesn't tell her husband what has happened to their son. So he is surprised that she wants to see Elisha when it's not the new moon or the Sabbath, but she brushes off his questioning, saying, "That's all right." Or in some translations, "All is well." This is all very odd, isn't it? We'll consider it more later, but all is obviously not well. Yet she hasn't cried, she hasn't informed her husband or instructed the hired mourners to be summoned. She is just being practical and doing what she believes needs to be done. She instructs the servant to make haste, and they approach Elisha on Mount Carmel. Elisha spots her and is immediately concerned, so he sends Gehazi on ahead to ask if she, her husband, and her son are all okay. Again she replies, "Everything is all right," or "All is well." She hadn't come to speak to Gehazi. She needs to get to Elisha. When she reaches the prophet, she takes hold of him by the feet, at which point Gehazi goes to push her away. But Elisha recognizes the deep distress she has managed to hide thus far, although he says that God has not revealed the cause to him. All her previous concerns from when the baby was promised come back to the surface as she cries out, "Did I ask you for a son, my Lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?" Elisha thinks Gehazi will get to the boy more quickly, so sends him off to run without stopping to lay the prophet's staff on the boy's face. But the Shunammite woman is not satisfied and insists that she will stay with Elisha until he too goes to her son. Gehazi races ahead, but the laying on of the staff has no effect, which he rushes back to inform Elisha. Elisha makes it to the house, goes up to his room, and closes the door. He prays to God and then stretches himself out on top of the dead child, at which point the boy's body starts to warm. Elisha paces to and fro in the room and then stretches out on the boy once more. This time, he sneezes 7 times and opens his eyes. We should remember that 7 is the biblical number for completeness, so this is a sign of the full restoration of life which has occurred. Elisha summons Gehazi and tells him to call the Shunammite woman, and when she comes in, he says, "Take your son." This time, she falls at Elisha's feet rather than grabbing him by them, and bows down in awe of the miracle that has taken place. Then we are simply told that she took her son and went out. There are lots of echoes and similarities between the two stories, aren't there, despite their unique elements too. The female protagonists, who both show extreme hospitality in their own ways, who both recognize the prophets as men of God, the way God honors and blesses them for their faith and service. The fact that they were both in a place of vulnerability in terms of their widowhood and poverty, or barrenness and seemingly imminent widowhood. The bitter rallying against the prophets after their sons' deaths. The upper rooms. The crying out to God of the prophets. The stretching out on the boys' bodies. The utter joy and worship once the restoration takes place. And probably more besides. But before we think more about what those repeated themes and aspects might have to teach us, we have our third, far briefer resurrection event to look at. We read about it in 2 Kings 13, verses 20 to 21. Elisha died and was buried. Now Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders, so they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. Imagine being one of the Israelites, busy burying their friend or family member. First, they are interrupted and in their terror resort to throwing the corpse into a nearby tomb. But then an awesome, but no doubt initially equally terrifying thing happens as the body is restored to life and stands up on its own 2 feet. They would never have imagined that they would be walking home, or perhaps running if the Moabites were still around, with their deceased friend or relative accompanying them on the journey, resurrected from the dead. So, those are the 3 instances of resurrection events in the Old Testament, in some ways very similar and in others very diverse. So we'd better move on to what they teach us. There are so many lessons to learn from these passages, and especially the 2 longer stories, that we could probably go on as long as Paul did when Eutychus fell out the window. So you'll be pleased to know that I've just picked the ones that stood out to me most. And the first thing is something I've already touched on, that these resurrection accounts are not something commonplace to grow dimmed to the importance of. They are utterly transformative displays of God's ultimate power over death. And yet, they are only a foretaste of the even greater and even more transformative resurrection to come. These 3 corpses restored to life would one day die again. But Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection demonstrate that he has won the ultimate victory over death, and that we too will enjoy a bodily resurrection in God's eternal kingdom. It is right that we are spending time in this Easter season focusing on this vital aspect of our faith. But let's keep focusing on it in the days, weeks, and months to come. Then I was struck by the fact that the two female protagonists in our longer stories are nameless, known simply as the widow of Zarephath and the Shunammite woman. This speaks volumes about the value placed on women at that time. Hopefully a baby was something the Shunammite wanted, but I was struck that the men, Elisha and Gehazi, decide this without checking how she feels. We can all think of people in the world today who are referred to in a nameless way, often again signifying the lack of value being placed on their existence and rights. But God sees and knows these women. He values them and longs to both bless and use them. May God help us to see the nameless with his eyes of love and compassion, and then act accordingly. We can't fail to notice the extreme hospitality which both women show as well. And we know that there are lots of calls in the Bible to be willing to offer hospitality, alongside many great examples. Perhaps, like the widow, we feel we have little to offer. But God, through Elijah, calls on her to be generous with the little she has, and she subsequently receives huge blessing and sustaining. Perhaps, unlike the Shunammite, we're not sure what we can do to be hospitable. The Shunammite certainly didn't have that problem. She was on the lookout for people to welcome and offer hospitality to. She persuades Elisha to stay for dinner, which leads to a lovely friendship. And then she goes on to radically change her home just so he will have somewhere to stay. Do we seek out opportunities to serve others and seize them when they appear? The Shunammite woman also receives God's blessing, as Elisha wants to show his gratitude for all she has done. Neither woman is saved by their works, as Paul would be quick to remind us, teaching in Ephesians 2 that it is by faith instead. But he does go on to say that God has prepared good works in advance for us to do, and it pleases him when we take up these opportunities. Another aspect which we can't fail to notice is how both women do not hold back their anger and anguish when they cry out to God via his prophets about their distress and suffering and the seeming unfairness of their situations. The widow asks if Elijah was just sent to judge her for her sinfulness, and the Shunammite reminds Elisha that she never asked for a child, rather begging for her hopes not to be raised in vain. Sometimes we feel guilty for even feeling angry towards God, let alone voicing these feelings. But God is quick to bestow his mercy and transforming love on these women's situations, in no way holding their anger and railing against them. The Psalms are a great source of encouragement in this regard too. They are full of examples of the writers expressing their despair, distress, and anger, whilst at the same time clinging on to their faith and hope in the Lord and his ability to intervene. If we are struggling to express our feelings of hurt, frustration, anger, or whatever else before God, we should be reminded that he's big enough and loving enough to take it. And we can also use the Psalms as a place to start if we're not sure how to open up in this way. I also have to include the mystery of the way the Shunammite tells both her husband and Gehazi that all is well. Commentators are really not quite sure what to make of it either. Some think she is just saying everything is fine because she can't have any distractions before she gets to Elisha as quickly as possible. Others believe that this is a sign of her unwavering faith, that God will act through Elisha to restore her son's life. So she really does believe that all is well. But the bitter distress she shows when she reaches the prophet argues against that to some degree. Or perhaps she thinks if she says it enough, she will be able to believe it. We'll never know for sure unless we can seek her out in eternity and ask her. But I was struck how often we are tempted to say, "I'm fine," when someone asks us how we're doing, even though there is probably a lot more to say. And also how often we accept "I'm fine" as an answer from someone else without bothering to follow up with a secondary check-in, especially being mindful of what Rob was talking about earlier with the charity Calm. That second check-in could be life-saving. And I was also reminded of the hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul," which was written by Horatio Spafford in 1873 after his 4 daughters drowned when the steamship they were travelling on sank. In the face of tragic loss, like the Shunammite, but without the miraculous restoration the woman experiences, he was able to write, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." May God grant us the peace to be able to echo those words, whether that was the Shunammite's experience or not. And then we must briefly mention that strange story of the man restored by coming into contact with Elisha's tomb. Some see this as a sign of the miraculous power contained within the relics of godly people and saints. And I'm sure many of us will have seen such items, believed to be relics of such people, on display in churches in Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, and so on. But I would rather say that this instance demonstrates God's amazing power and his ongoing intervention amongst his people. Elisha has died, and Israel are desperately missing his leading and guiding, going off the rails again and under attack from other nations. But God has not forgotten about them and wants to remind them of the prophet whose words and works they should still be mindful of. And it points us again to a future tomb where life will be restored in the most ultimate way, which will in turn offer resurrection hope to all who put their faith in the resurrected Jesus. As I say, I'm sure there are many more takeaways we could find in these amazing stories, but we must finally and briefly ask the question, what about us? We've already been challenged in various ways by these stories, but I just wanted to end with 2 final thoughts. Both the widow and the Shunammite woman were at first reluctant to open themselves up to the possibility of God's restoration. The widow had resigned herself to the fact that she and her son would soon starve to death before being rescued from that path by God's sustaining, which foreshadows the even more miraculous rescue from death in the resurrection of her son. The Shunammite vocalizes her reluctance more fully, asking Elisha not to mislead her or get her hopes up. Are there dark corners of our lives, hidden longings, secret hurts, which we are reluctant to open up to God, not quite trusting that he can handle them or bring the restoration we need? And finally, let's take a quick look at that second short passage we heard about the Shunammite woman from 2 Kings chapter 8. We find Elisha warning her to take her family and live somewhere else because a 7-year famine is coming to the land. On her return, she has to go and ask the king for her land back. It's ironic to think that Elisha had suggested speaking to the king on her behalf when he wanted to pay back her kindness, and now she perhaps could do with that help. But God has got it all under control, and Gehazi just happens to be at the palace chatting with the king about Elisha's miracles. He is quick to point out the connection to the Shunammite woman and any potential issues are smoothed away so her land is promptly returned to her. My mind goes back to those good works God has prepared for us to do. The miraculous restoration of life has taken place, but further restorations happen too, with Elisha saving her family from famine and Gehazi speaking up on her behalf. In the same way, while we might not be privileged, like Elijah and Elisha, to be involved in any resurrection events, God can and indeed longs to use us to bring restoration and transformation as his resurrection power works through us for his praise and glory. May God show us where he has prepared to use us in this way in the week ahead. Amen.